It started like any other afternoon in the city. Crowded streets, horns echoing, and people lost in their screens. But then, one man stopped walking. A homeless man, sitting quietly beside a cafe, was being mocked by a young influencer live streaming to his thousands of followers. The laughter of the crowd mixed with the cruel comments flooding the screen. To everyone watching, it was entertainment. To the man being humiliated, it was another reminder that the world had forgotten his humanity. As the influencer continued, his phone capturing every second, something shifted in the background. The distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder, closer, until it drowned out the laughter. One by one, engines revved like thunder rolling through the streets. Heads turned, cameras lowered. The influencer froze as a line of bikers appeared, their presence commanding silence. What had been a cruel spectacle was about to become a moment no one would ever forget. The bikers stopped beside the homeless man, their leather jackets reflecting the sun, their expressions unreadable. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply stood there, a wall of solidarity between cruelty and kindness. The influencer tried to laugh it off, but the audience watching online could feel the tension shift. What had been mockery now looked like cowardice. And for the first time, the influencer's fame fell smaller than the silence of those who stood for what was right. One of the bikers knelt beside the homeless man, placing a hand on his shoulder, and asked softly, "You okay, brother?" That simple gesture, captured by dozens of phones, spoke louder than all the influencer's words. The man, who moments ago had been invisible, was now the center of something sacred: respect. The live stream that began as humiliation had transformed into a lesson about dignity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need a shout to be heard. And in that moment, the story flipped. The influencer's followers, once laughing, began flooding the chat with anger, disappointment, and shame. The clip spread faster than he could delete it, turning his fame into a warning. The bikers didn't need revenge. They gave him something far more powerful: a mirror. A mirror reflecting who he truly was, and who the world still had the chance to become. The crowd that had gathered moments earlier didn't know how to react. The influencer, once so confident in his cruel performance, now stood frozen in front of 100 silent witnesses, each one wrapped in black leather, their eyes hidden behind dark visors. The laughter that had once filled the street vanished, replaced by the low growl of idling motorcycles. For the first time, the noise of compassion was louder than mockery. The homeless man, still sitting on the ground, lifted his gaze slowly. His trembling hands clutched a torn piece of cardboard that read only one word: hope. That simple word caught in the sunlight between the chrome and steel of the motorcycles, turning what had been humiliation into a living symbol of redemption. One of the bikers stepped forward, knelt beside him, and gently handed him a bottle of water. No one spoke, but the silence said everything. It was the kind of silence that makes even the cruelest heart question itself. The influencer, realizing that his camera was still streaming live, tried to twist the moment into a joke. But the audience was no longer laughing. Comments flooded in, not with emojis or applause, but with anger, disappointment, and shame. "Stop recording. Apologize. This isn't funny anymore." For the first time, the influencer was losing the one thing he valued most: his image. The same lens he used to humiliate others was now exposing his own emptiness. The bikers stood as a single wall of defiance, not violent, not vengeful, but unmovable. Their silence carried the weight of something sacred: justice without cruelty, strength without pride. They didn't come to fight. They came to remind the world that kindness, too, can be loud. The influencer lowered his phone, his smirk fading. He looked around, surrounded by faces that no longer admired him, and realized that the stage he had built for mockery had turned into his trial. The homeless man tried to speak, but could only whisper, "Why?" The question hung in the air, and though no one answered it directly, everyone there knew the truth. The world had become so obsessed with entertainment that it had forgotten empathy. Until now. Until 100 engines stopped to remind them what humanity still sounded like. As the scene spread online, millions watched it unfold in disbelief. The video that was meant to showcase cruelty became a testament to compassion. People from every corner of the internet shared it, not to mock, but to reflect. Hashtags appeared overnight. Hashtag Justice on Wheels. Hashtag Bikers for Humanity. Hashtag Be Kind Not Cruel. What had started as a moment of humiliation had evolved into a movement, proving that even in a world addicted to attention, decency could still go viral. But while the internet debated, the bikers stayed where they were. They didn't care about fame or hashtags. They helped the homeless man to his feet, offering him food and a jacket. The leader of the group, a veteran with a scar running across his face, looked at him and said, "You've had enough people looking down on you. It's time someone stood beside you." Those words were simple, but they carried the weight of every injustice the man had endured. The influencer, meanwhile, tried to disappear into the crowd, but the bikers wouldn't let him. Not out of vengeance, but out of principle. One of them stepped in front of him and said calmly, "If you've got the courage to mock, you've got the courage to make it right." The influencer swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. For once, the camera wasn't a shield, it was a mirror. He hesitated, then turned toward the homeless man, the live stream still running. What followed was awkward, clumsy, but real. The influencer's apology stumbled out of his mouth, his voice cracking. The man he had mocked simply nodded, not out of acceptance, but out of grace. The crowd watched in silence, the sound of motorcycles humming beneath the weight of forgiveness. It was not the kind of drama the internet was used to. It was raw, uncomfortable, human. And as the sun began to set behind the city skyline, the homeless man stood between two worlds, one that had ridiculed him and one that had protected him. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as content, not as pity, but as a person. And in that fragile, beautiful silence, everyone present learned that dignity, once stolen, can always be reclaimed by those brave enough to defend it. The next morning, the video had reached millions. Headlines flooded every social platform. Bikers stand up against cruel influencer. Homeless man finds justice in the streets. The influencer's channel, once filled with laughter and praise, was now buried under comments demanding accountability. His sponsors withdrew, his follower count plummeted, and for the first time, he faced the consequences of his actions, not in silence, but in public. The world had turned the camera back on him. But while his reputation burned, the homeless man's story began to shine. People recognized him from the video, approaching with food, money, and words of encouragement. Yet what mattered most to him wasn't the attention. It was the way people now looked at him instead of through him. That simple shift, that restoration of dignity, was worth more than any donation. The bikers didn't stop at one act of kindness. They organized a ride across the city to raise awareness for the homeless community, calling it Wheels of Respect. What started with one man became a mission to restore humanity wherever it had been forgotten. Each mile they rode was a declaration that compassion could be as loud as thunder if enough hearts decided to move together. Meanwhile, the influencer watched from the sidelines, struggling with the weight of his own guilt. The internet had done what it always does. It condemned quickly and moved on. But he couldn't. He saw the video replayed everywhere, each view another reflection of who he had been. And for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, shame mixed with the desire to be better. In a quiet moment, he reached out to the biker group, asking to meet. The message was brief, uncertain. "I want to help make this right." Many expected the bikers to ignore him, but they didn't. Because to them, justice wasn't about destroying someone. It was about giving them the chance to change. When the influencer arrived at the bikers' clubhouse, he expected hostility. Instead, he was met with silence, and eyes that had seen too much of the world to judge too quickly. The leader stood up from his chair, crossed his arms, and asked, "You really want to make it right?" The influencer nodded, his voice barely audible. "Then prove it," the biker said. "Not online. Out here." And so he did. For weeks, the influencer volunteered alongside the bikers, handing out food, raising funds, and helping those who lived on the streets. Cameras occasionally followed him, but this time, his gestures weren't for show. There was no dramatic music, no editing, just real people helping real people. Slowly, the internet's mockery turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into respect. The homeless man who had once been humiliated became part of their mission too. He joined them on their rides, his story becoming a symbol of redemption and forgiveness. The very man who had been mocked now shared stages with the one who had mocked him, proving that humanity can rise from the most broken of places. Together, they spoke in schools, shelters, and churches, reminding others that one act of cruelty can be undone by 1,000 acts of grace. The world began to take notice. News outlets praised the transformation, calling it one of the most powerful reversals ever seen online. But the bikers didn't care for the fame. They cared for the faces they met along the way, the small victories no headline would ever mention. A meal shared, a life lifted, a hand held in the dark. And in every city they rode through, the sound of engines no longer meant fear or rebellion. It meant hope. A promise that someone would always stand up for the voiceless, no matter how loud the world's cruelty became. Weeks turned into months, and what had started as a viral story evolved into a global movement. Videos of the bikers' missions spread across continents. Motorcycle clubs from different countries began organizing their own rides of kindness. They carried food, blankets, and dignity to the forgotten corners of their cities. Everywhere their engines roared, they left behind something far greater than noise. They left hope. The influencer continued to work beside them, no longer chasing fame, but meaning. His followers, those who had once cheered for his pranks, now watched something entirely different. They saw humility replace arrogance, service replace selfishness. Many couldn't believe the change, but those who looked closely could see it was real. Redemption, they learned, wasn't about pretending the past never happened. It was about building something better from its ruins. The homeless man, once invisible to the world, had become its quiet teacher. When reporters tried to glorify his story, he would simply say, "Don't thank me. Thank them, the ones who stopped when everyone else walked by." His words cut through the noise of the media, reminding people that heroism isn't always loud, and kindness doesn't need attention to be powerful. The bikers' unity fascinated everyone who watched. Their rough exteriors hid hearts that had known pain, loss, and rejection. Many of them had lived lives on the edge, but this cause gave them purpose. They weren't just rescuing others, they were rescuing themselves. With every act of compassion, they rewrote the world's perception of who they were. And in doing so, they healed old wounds they had carried for years. Every time they rode together, the same man led at the front, the one who had first knelt beside the homeless man. His words had become their mantra, printed on jackets, banners, and hearts. It's never too late to stand for what's right. And in that belief, they found a brotherhood not built by rebellion, but by redemption. One day, the influencer and the homeless man returned to the very spot where it all began. The same cafe, the same street, but everything felt different now. The man no longer sat on the ground. He stood tall, dressed neatly, his eyes filled with calm. The influencer approached him quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. No cameras, no audience, just 2 men, face to face, bound by a moment that had changed both their lives forever. "I used to see people as content," the influencer admitted softly. "I never realized how empty that made me feel." The homeless man smiled, his expression gentle. "And I used to think no one would ever see me again," he replied. "But maybe it just takes one wrong act to start something right." The two shared a quiet laugh, different men than the ones the world had once watched collide. A few bikers parked nearby, watching from a distance. They didn't interrupt, because they understood that this was not their moment. It was the world's reminder of what change looks like. One of them murmured, "We didn't just give justice that day. We gave humanity back to both of them." The others nodded, their engines silent, as though even the machines understood the gravity of that truth. Passers-by recognized the men and smiled, not with the cold curiosity of viral fame, but with warmth. The street where humiliation had once echoed was now sacred ground, a living monument to transformation. Every person who walked by knew the story, and each time they remembered it, they walked away a little softer, a little more aware. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, the rumble of motorcycles returned once more, not as a threat, but as a hymn. Their engines roared not for war or vengeance, but as a chorus for humanity itself. It was the sound of redemption, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, only understanding. As time passed, the world didn't forget what had happened. It grew from it. News outlets revisited the story, not to sensationalize it, but to understand why it had struck such a universal chord. Viewers saw more than a viral moment. They saw a reflection of themselves. The influencer's fall and rise reminded people of their own flaws, and the homeless man's forgiveness reminded them of the strength it takes to let go of pain. In a time when outrage ruled the internet, this story had done the impossible. It restored faith. The biker group, now known across the nation, continued their mission under a simple name, the Brotherhood of the Road. They traveled from city to city, responding to injustice wherever it appeared. From helping bullied teenagers to feeding hungry families, their cause evolved from a single act into a movement. They had no sponsors, no hidden agenda, only a shared belief that kindness was worth fighting for. One evening, they were invited to a community center to speak with a group of young people. The influencer, once a symbol of vanity, stood beside the man he had once humiliated. The room fell silent as he began to speak, not with practiced charm, but with raw honesty. "I thought power came from followers," he said, his voice steady, "but it comes from the people who believe in you when you don't deserve it." Those words, once impossible for him to say, now carried the weight of redemption. The homeless man took the microphone next. He spoke softly, almost whispering, but every word landed like a stone in still water. "When they stood for me, I realized something. Justice doesn't mean revenge. It means helping someone else stand when they've fallen. And that's something anyone can do, no matter who you are." The crowd rose in quiet applause, not out of spectacle, but respect. Afterward, as the bikers prepared to leave, children ran up to touch their jackets, asking questions about courage and kindness. The leader smiled and said, "It's not about being fearless. It's about choosing not to walk away when someone needs you." It was the simplest truth of all, and yet the hardest one to live by. The movement began to ripple far beyond the roads. Other biker clubs joined the cause, creating networks of support for the homeless, the abused, and the forgotten. Every weekend, cities echoed with the sound of engines not meant for rebellion, but for mercy. The very symbol once feared by society had become its armor. The roar of motorcycles became a sound of comfort, a sign that somewhere, justice was being delivered. The influencer, now humbled and transformed, continued to use his platform, but this time for good. His new videos didn't chase shock value. They told stories. Stories of kindness, of struggle, of resilience. His viewers returned, but not for entertainment. They came for truth. He often said, "If you've ever filmed someone's pain for views, you owe the world something better. You owe it honesty." And in those words, he found a purpose far stronger than fame. The homeless man became a counselor for others living on the streets. He shared his story not to inspire pity, but to prove that brokenness could be rebuilt. "We all need someone to stop for us," he would say, "but sometimes we also need to learn how to stop for others." His message reached thousands, spreading like quiet fire through hearts that had long forgotten what compassion felt like. The bikers kept riding, not for recognition, but because they knew there was always another corner of the world where someone was being forgotten. Each new mission carried echoes of that first day, when they surrounded a cruel act and turned it into something sacred. To them, every ride was a promise to never let the world grow too cold, too busy, too cruel to care. And so, the legend grew. Not a story of bikers versus an influencer, but of humanity rediscovered on a noisy street where compassion found its voice. The kind of story that doesn't fade when the engines stop, but continues quietly in the hearts of those who watched and whispered, "I want to be like them." Months later, the Brotherhood was invited to a national conference about social responsibility. They arrived not in suits or polished shoes, but on their motorcycles, their engines announcing them louder than any speech ever could. The audience stood as they entered, the sound of applause echoing through the hall like thunder. The same men once labeled as outlaws now stood before the country as symbols of justice, proof that real strength comes not from power, but from compassion. The influencer and the homeless man walked onto the stage side by side. Cameras flashed, but this time the story wasn't about scandal. It was about salvation. The influencer spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "I used to think the world owed me attention," he said. "Now I know what it really owes is empathy." His confession wasn't rehearsed. It came from somewhere deep, and the room felt it. You could hear the breath catch in the audience as they saw not an influencer, but a man finally free from his own reflection. Then came the homeless man, dressed simply but standing tall. He told the crowd about the day the bikers stopped, about how it didn't just save him, it saved everyone who watched. "We think kindness is small," he said, "but it isn't. It's the only thing that grows when you give it away." His words hung in the air like a prayer, and for a moment, even the cameras stopped clicking. The bikers watched silently from the edge of the stage, their arms crossed, their faces steady. They didn't need to speak. They had already said everything with their actions. They had proven that even the roughest hands could protect, that even the loudest engines could carry grace. And as they stood there, the world saw them for what they truly were. Not rebels without a cause, but warriors of mercy. When the event ended, something remarkable happened. The audience didn't rush to the exits. They lingered. They hugged. They spoke to strangers. That was the legacy of the movement. Not fame or recognition, but connection. The bikers had built a bridge between hearts that had forgotten how to meet halfway. Eventually, the cameras stopped filming, the headlines faded, and the world moved on, as it always does. But for those who had been part of that moment, life was never the same. The influencer no longer sought validation in numbers, but in lives changed. He used his earnings to fund shelters and projects that gave others a second chance. He often said, "The day they stopped for him was the day I learned to stop for others." The homeless man rebuilt his life, one day at a time. With help from the bikers, he found a job, a small apartment, and, most importantly, peace. He still carried his old cardboard sign, not to beg, but as a reminder. On it, the word hope remained, faded and worn, yet truer than ever. It was a symbol of the moment the world had chosen kindness over cruelty. As for the bikers, they continued to ride. Not every mission was as grand, not every act was filmed, but that didn't matter. They rode for the ones no one noticed, the forgotten souls at the edge of society. Each rumble of their engines became a heartbeat of compassion moving through the cities. To see them pass was to feel a promise that good still exists, and it wears no uniform. One evening, under a fading sunset, the Brotherhood gathered on a hill overlooking the city lights. The leader looked at his men and said quietly, "We didn't change the world, but we reminded it what it could be." No one answered. They just nodded, helmets in hand, eyes reflecting the horizon. Then the engines roared to life one last time, echoing through the dusk like a hymn of freedom and faith. And somewhere in that city below, a man looked up, recognizing the sound. He smiled softly, whispering a single word that had once been written on a piece of cardboard but was now carved into his soul: hope. What began as an act of cruelty ended as a story of redemption, a moment that reminded the world that kindness still has the power to roar louder than hate. A homeless man who once sat invisible in the corner of a busy street became the symbol of something far greater. The day humanity paused, listened, and chose to stand on the right side of compassion. That single moment did not just expose cruelty, it reignited conscience. The bikers never saw themselves as heroes. They didn't come for applause or fame. They came because silence had gone on for too long. Their engines became the heartbeat of a message the world needed to hear. That justice doesn't always come from courts or titles, but from ordinary people who refuse to look away. Their legacy wasn't built on rebellion. It was built on courage, empathy, and the belief that decency is never outdated. The influencer's journey proved another truth: change is possible. It takes humility to face one's own reflection, to admit wrong, and to rebuild something broken. In him, we saw not the downfall of a man, but the rebirth of a conscience. And in the homeless man, we saw what true strength looks like, not in revenge, but in forgiveness. Together, they became living proof that even the darkest stories can end with light. And maybe that's what this story truly teaches us, that no act of kindness is ever too small, and no soul is ever too far gone. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people willing to stand up, to stop, and to do what's right even when no one is watching. Because sometimes, one moment of humanity can change 1,000 hearts. If this story touched you, let it echo beyond this video. Share your thoughts below. Your voice might inspire someone else to act. And if you believe the world needs more stories that remind us who we are meant to be, make sure to subscribe, like, and stay with us. Together, we can keep spreading hope until kindness becomes louder than cruelty.